these two women taught a very memorable breakout workshop at Responsive Conference last year on belonging at AirBNB. And perhaps more than any other presenter last year, we got feedback that their workshop had created tactics and influenced other people's approaches to belonging long after. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming back this year. Andrea Robb is the Director of Talent and Talent Operations at AirBNB, and Kate Shaw is the Director of Learning. So this year, they're going to be presenting on some of the struggles and opportunities associated with a very rapid growth organization, which they've, of course, experienced firsthand at AirBNB. They're going to be discussing the best practices that they've learned, including how to focus on people amidst change, and the best ways to foster an environment of learning and continual improvement. So without any further ado, let me welcome to the stage Kate and Andrea. Delighted to have you both here.
Less conversation, a little more action. All this aggravation and satisfaction in the middle. A little more bite, a little less spark. A little less bite, a little more spark. Shut your mouth and open up your heart. Ever satisfy me.
Hi, everybody. Is this on? Okay. Can you hear us? We are so excited to be here. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk a little bit about belonging. We've been thinking about this for a while now. As Robin mentioned, we were here at the conference last year and did a bit of a breakout section to talk about what sort of behaviors lead to belonging, what sort of environment leads to belonging, and we've been doing a lot of work since that we thought would be worth sharing. And then, of course, we're bumping into a lot of questions that we have as well, and we're hoping that you can help us think on some of those questions. For some of you who might not be familiar with AirBNB, we're an organization that's about 10 years old. We are in the business of home sharing and now experience sharing the world over. We're in 80,000 cities worldwide, 191 countries worldwide. We have a little over 4,000 employees who are dispersed across over 30 offices worldwide. It's a very fast-paced, fast-moving organization that's changing very rapidly, and it's been a really exciting ride to be there. As some of you may know, the mission of AirBNB is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere, and it was one of the reasons I know why I joined AirBNB, I think why Andrea joined AirBNB as well, is we were really inspired by that mission. And we also became very much inspired by that mission as we were thinking about our work within employee experience.
So the last year, since we were here last, we talked about belonging and walked people through an exercise around what it means to belong or not belong. So then we employed a strategy in the last year that we want to take you along a journey around, and then we want to ask you a question that we're currently struggling with. But this has been our strategy. So I'll talk about the first two. In talent design, we often do a lot of the research that will then funnel into learning. And we decided to set about last year to really understand belonging, and we partnered with Dr. Greg Walton at Stanford University, who's a social psychologist who focuses on belonging. We also hired a research liaison by the name of Lauren Aguilar with Forche Consulting, who studied under Greg. And he is actually conducting independent research on belonging at AirBNB. So we're in the midst of that. I don't actually have any of the findings yet, but we're already learning something through early surveys. Along with that, we are using our people analytics team to really understand the data and understand what is driving belonging and what is not through our regular murmur surveys. We also are using that same group at Stanford to help us create an instrument, an index called Belonging Index, which is going to soon replace engagement. And we think that's where many of us should be going, is engagement sort of a metric for the 1990s in my mind. It was about how much additional work you can expect out of someone based on how they're engaged. And belonging is going much deeper.
So in addition to that, as Andrea mentioned, we're embarking upon this research, and as a follow-on to that research, our hope is to leverage the insights that are gained there and turn those into learning interventions on behalf of our employees. The idea being that the more we learn about how we create belonging for ourselves, how we create belonging for each other, ideally we put that into the system as quickly as possible and start experimenting with different learning interventions that we hope will actually lead to real outcomes. So as Andrea mentioned, we're working on creating a belonging index that we hope will create a baseline for our interventions with the idea that we'll hopefully see that metric change over time. And with any learning intervention we also have a corresponding practice that goes along with it, which is one of the reasons why Andrea and I work so closely together. We see our work as being very much intertwined, where Andrea's group is really focused on building skeletal structures within the organization, the systems, the tools, the practices, the organizational structures, where learning helps employees build the muscle to make those structures and practices really come to life.
So in the last year, as we are starting to put these practices in place, partnering with the Clayman Institute at Stanford on gender research, we started to feel very good about these practices of blocking bias, not only in the interview process, but throughout the whole talent pipeline. And even with that wind behind our backs, we realized and had this initial insight about a month ago where we started to think about an analog for an insight around D&I practices in general. And the analog is this, sort of like the history of psychology. And initially, for those of you who studied psychology like I did, in the 90s, it was all about Freud, or at least at Michigan, it was all about Freud. I learned a lot about neuroses and psychoses. Really, it wasn't until the 90s where we started to be introduced to more positive psychology movements, Martin Seligman being one of the major voices there. And he really started to look at well-being and happiness and how do we start focusing on what's right with us. And in that work, he laid out a multi-layered, or almost like an onion approach to wellness. So it's not just pleasure, but it's other things like engagement, meaning, relationships, accomplishments, etc. So what came to us was this analog, and then in the next slide, what we realized is this feels very similar to what we're confronted with D&I practices and what the norms are and what the research is saying. So what we are starting to back into is this acknowledgement that right now, D&I is very focused on unconscious bias, and that our brains are broken, and that we know through evolution that we have in-group, out-group biases, and that those things exist in all of us, and that we know that's important to acknowledge. We feel that there's a compendium to that research, and it's the research that shows us that also humans are happier when they feel like they're belonging and when they're connected. So this to us felt like the crux of what we need to do next is to really start driving belonging and not just focus on busting bias.
So while we're committed to both, what we really believe inherently is that creating belonging is simply more inspiring than battling bias. So while we can certainly focus our practices on battling bias and debugging bias, for example, from performance reviews or talent calibrations or recruiting, et cetera, that work is absolutely commendable. It absolutely has to be done. However, we also know that there's a lot of conversation within the D&I space that has frankly left a lot of people behind or has made them feel like they don't really belong in the conversation. And it's something that we're very mindful of and that we really want to fix. So we've started to talk about belonging, creating belonging both for yourself and for others really truly is a 21st century skill set. The globe is not changing. Things are only going to become more diverse. It's not the case that more and more companies, of course, as you all know, are focused on diversity because not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because they know it leads to better outcomes. It leads to greater innovation. It leads to greater profits, et cetera. So if we start to build working in diverse environments and doing it well is truly a differentiated skill set, then we think that we can bring more people along in the story. Right? We'll ultimately achieve better outcomes. So that I understand my life is going to be richer, my work is going to be better, everything about my work life is going to be more rewarding because I now understand more about how to create belonging, not just for me, but for everyone around me.
So as Kate said, that inspired us and got us going and really delving into the research around belonging. That and our mission being about belonging, we felt like it was on us to help define this. And if we do this well, we hope that others will be inspired to go a little deeper than engagement and start to really think about this fundamental human need. So here is what we learned through our literature review in the last year. And I found this to be also very interesting and another analog to the Martin Seligman work. So Martin Seligman talks about the layers of wellness or well-being. And belonging actually has many layers. So belonging, the sense of belonging is your core belief and your sense or your emotions around, do I belong here? If I'm walking around this conference, do I see faces that are familiar? Do I see people who look like me? And we all have that initial hit of like, do I belong here or not? But in a workplace, there are other signals that we're constantly taking in, and that is shaping whether we believe we belong or not in the place that we're working. So first out of the gate is my manager supporting my own sense of belonging? That manager is key. So obviously that starts to get us thinking about interventions there. Am I respected, valued, and contributing? So I can feel safe with my team, my manager can support me, but if I go into a work meeting and my idea presented was picked up by someone else and then acknowledged, as so many women leaders have, an experience of, then I'm not feeling respected for my own contributions. And then last is social connection. Do I feel like I just have a general social connection with others in the workplace that also contributes to my overall sense of belonging? So this was the general baseline that we started to use to think about belonging that fell out of the research and the belonging index that we just built for ourselves and are about to set sail with in about a week here at AirBNB. So that brought us to an interesting finding, and this is going to be where we provoke some thinking from the audience. So Kate.
So one of the interesting findings out of this literature review for us was the distinction that we might make between support and belonging. So again, another strategy that we commonly use to promote diversity and belonging in the workplace is what we would at AirBNB called Affinity Groups, but in the real world, the rest of the world, be called Affinity Groups. And the idea here being, of course, that you get together with people who are like you, have shared interests, have shared backgrounds, whether it's ethnic or gender or what have you. And what we've started to understand within that work is that those groups might be creating a sense of support for one another. They aren't necessarily creating a sense of belonging. And belonging is really only achieved when members of a minority group are in relationship with people in the dominant group. Right? So we shouldn't be mistaking support for belonging. They're not actually one and the same. And of course, when we heard this, we thought, oh my gosh, what does that actually mean then for D&I strategies that so oftentimes rely almost entirely on the extra work of people who are already potentially feeling very disenfranchised. So that is one provocation that we would certainly be curious to get into with you. And it also is making us think about, who do we partner with in the organization? Should we be partner with members of our minority groups, or should we be partnering with our groups of members of majority groups, or should we be doing both? And with limited resources and time, what does that actually look like? So with that provocation and anything else that you have on mind, what we would like to ask of you all, because by all means, as Andrea mentioned, we're at the very beginning of this still. We have a lot of questions that are still unanswered, and we'd love to invite you to think on something with us, which is if you're going to step away from the notion that you're here to block bias at work, and instead you're here to create a sense of belonging, what does that actually look like? If you're going to design a learning intervention from scratch for people in your organization around the space of belonging, what would you design? So we're going to ask you to pair up and discuss amongst yourselves. This is a pretty meaty topic, so I would suggest about 4 minutes for you to get together in pairs and discuss amongst someone, hopefully around you, and think about what would that look like, with the idea that we'll then come back as a group and just popcorn out any insights that came out of your conversations. All right?
And we'll go back one slide to remind you of the question.
Yeah. So what did I just say, 4 minutes with your partner? I'm also eyeing the clock.
I think it's 3.
Okay.
We'll give you the 1 minute warning.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. All right. I didn't give you the 1 minute warning. Can they hear?
Let's try Robin's thing. There, see, it works.
All right. I didn't give you the 1 minute warning, but we did give you an extra minute of time. And so what we would like you to do now is we're going to ask just for you to share out any insights that came from this discussion. We know that we only gave you tidbits of what we're working on and a short amount of time on a very big topic. But we believe in this audience, so we believe we're going to be able to pull some ideas from you. So what we're going to ask you to do is, if you have an insight you want to share, or an idea you want to share, we're going to ask you to line up in the microphones now. And then we're going to share those out so that everybody can have a sense of the nature of the conversations. So who's ready? Come on down. And if you can hit a microphone on either side. Do you have a question before you go? Okay, so go ahead. So we're going to spend the last 5 minutes here just learning from you what types of experiences, either learning or just regular employee experiences, would you recommend based on this finding around support and belonging? All right. So
Ideally, we'll ask people to go quickly because I'm just seeing 6 people at the mic, and we have about 4 minutes left in our session. So
like
yeah,
less than 30 seconds.
So just really quick. Yeah.
Okay, so we were saying that bias can create like an us versus them mentality. So a way to go around that is to create like a mentorship program with people from different backgrounds, not within your function who you would see every day, but like someone else would be.
Great. So next one.
That's great, thanks.
We were discussing about creating shared spaces where people can feel explicitly safe in terms of different personalities, different styles of working. Sometimes in our company, people tend to imitate what leaders are doing. Sometimes the leaders are more outspoken, more vocal. So we were discussing about creating explicit zones where more shy people or more different people in many ways can feel explicitly safe and acknowledged.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go to this one?
I appreciated this because what came to mind for me are the sometimes the biases or the kinds of lack of belonging that people don't always talk about, right? Divorce, caretaking, single parent by choice, person with no children by choice. So as I was thinking about it, opportunities to create, for people to share a little window into their world so that others can understand the shoes that they walk in. Because there's, especially at the size of a company like AirBNB, there's going to be, if I'm going through it, so is 50 to 100 other people, and we just don't know who we are. So maybe a way to either share that lens in there, but also a way for them to find each other. Tricky though, because of confidentiality and things, but there may be opportunities.
All right, we'll go ahead and send one more.
Thank you. Vishnu and I were talking about the idea of around jobs and around the different positions that people have in a firm. One way to make people feel like they belong is to appreciate every single one. Because I could sit here and say, here's an engine, and we could argue over which part of the engine is more important. At the end of the day, you need all of those parts in order to function. And then Vishnu drew this great circle with sort of, you have the overarching leadership here, and people just kind of coming into, here's the purpose. But that makes people feel like they belong.
That's great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll go to this side.
That captures one of our ideas beautifully. Christina, my partner, said it differs by players, so ask. So find out. The second thing we were talking about is co-creation, whether cross-functional dialogues, cross-level, multiple levels of the organization being in dialogue to co-create whatever it might be, our priorities, our strategy, our processes, etc. Gives a sense of that true ownership and having impact.
Yeah, and maybe more likelihood that you have in-group and minority groups interacting.
Yeah.
Great.
That's great. Yeah,
Right.
with impact. Yeah.
All
thank
right,
you.
so I'm going to go back to this side here.
Hi. Our group talked about being able to bring your whole self to work, so not having to hide elements of your identity makes it a lot easier to feel like you belong, to get support in all those spaces, and feel like your workspace is a safe space to do that. And also vulnerability and talking about what you don't know, what you want to learn more about, what scares you is a conversation that's difficult to have, particularly with diversity. So all groups need to be able to have that conversation together.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
I feel like I'm a little biased here. Part of my work is based on how to create belonging through narrative and art. And I'll just say one thing about art is it's like in whose context do we engage? And one thing that I love about engaging art is it's the the only form that I'll say is a language that everyone can relate on common ground, and whether it's, no matter what language you speak, you can relate on that ground. So bring more art into the context.
All right.
Thank you.
And I think we've got time for one more, and then we'll wrap up.
So similar to what Jeremy actually just said. So again, using art to create ambient belonging, but also to nudge people towards behaviors that we can all take, or actions that we can all take, behaviors that we can all role model in order to advance the conversation and create inclusion for everybody, which is what nudge art, which you might have seen out in the space, is aimed at.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. We so wish do we have time for one? Or,
The clock,
we do.
Yep, we do.
Yes,
We have
get
one
the yes
more.
from Grace.
I'm Victor from Monterrey, Mexico, and I have been working as a coach, executive and life coach, and I see these stories behind the walls with people on one-on-one. And what I think is important to have in mind is that about the bias is the first problem is our unconsciousness of our bias. So one thing that is really helpful is to create such an environment that helps us to remind us our biases. For instance, personality is our first unconscious bias. Most people would like that everybody behaves, communicates, and thinks the same you do, and that's typical of the personality. There's a lot of tools, but specifically coming from Mexico, what I can share to you is something that helped us a lot there with coaches. Is a book called The 4 Agreements. It's really, really helpful book talking about biases, because it's about don't take everything personal, don't make assumptions, make your best effort ever, and the fourth one is
be impeccable with your word.
Yeah, your words. Take care, impeccable words. So I think that looking at this is our work with bias is mostly very on the brain, but we need to consider also that beyond the words is the emotions that people is having about this.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We wish we could go on all day, and we can't. But thank you so much for the ideas. We're definitely going to take those back, and we're here the rest of the day and tomorrow if you are interested in talking more. Thanks so much for your time.
And one final note, we are Group 7 facilitators, and we are going to go into that middle mezzanine area. I don't know what that area is called, where they have the installations. And if you want to continue this conversation and you haven't been assigned to our group, we talked to Robin. He's cool with, if you want to continue this discussion, our group facilitation will be around belonging, and we welcome you to come and have a chat with us, ask questions, or we can continue to explore any of these ideas.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, can we get a standing ovation for Kate and Andrea? Thank you very much for coming back.